Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If this is the first time that you've seen me on YouTube, my name's Eloise. I've just finished a law degree at the University of York, and in a couple of months I'm starting a Masters in Law at the University of Oxford. So today I thought I'd do a video that's been requested quite a few times and talk a little bit and give some advice on how I wrote my dissertation last year. Now obviously my experiences are quite particular to law, but the advice that I'm giving I think should be pretty broadly applicable across sort of social sciences and humanities especially. As you can probably see from all of the clickbait that I've doubtless put everywhere, I ended up doing pretty well in my dissertation. I got 85%, which was a lot higher than I was expecting. I think it was the joint second highest grade in my year, and overall in my degree I graduated with the highest first in my cohort. So hopefully I kind of know what I'm doing a little bit at this point, and hopefully you can take something from my advice. Okay, I've got 6 sections to this video. I'll put them in timestamps down here in case you're particularly interested in any of them. So I'm going to start off by talking about timing, so what I did at which point throughout the year that I was writing my dissertation. Then I'm going to talk about how I came up with a topic and a question to write about. And after that I'm going to talk about how I found my reading and then how I took notes on that reading. And then finally I'll talk about how I planned the dissertation and then how I wrote it. Okay, I think that's everything, so let's get into the video. Okay, so timing. My key message with timing is that you need to do what works for you, and I think a really good way to do that is to sit down at the beginning of the year and look at how your academic year is structured. So for me, I knew that I had 2 massive assessments over Christmas, so I probably wasn't going to have much time to get my dissertation done, but then I had less towards the end of the year, so I knew that I could do the bulk of the work then. So the way that it ended up working for me, I came up with my topic and my question in late October, early November, and I think it was handy to have my question thought up early on so that I could think about it throughout the year. But I didn't actually really start working on the project until 8 weeks before the deadline. So I think before that 8-week period I'd read maybe a handful of sources. I certainly hadn't sort of worked out what my argument was or done any proper planning. Now that might be different for you. It might be the case that you'll work better if you do work consistently throughout the year. It might be the case that your year is structured differently, but I knew for me I wanted the headspace to really get into it and to not work on anything else for that period of 8 weeks. And also I knew that I didn't have many assessments that would get in the way at that point in the year. It's something to consider and something to talk about with your supervisor. I think I definitely freaked my supervisor out a little bit by not handing in any work until very late on, but it ended up working pretty well for me. So at the beginning of that 8-week period, I planned out all of my time. The first block that I did was for researching, so I did all my reading, made my notes and started to form an argument. And the way that I planned that out is I gave it, I think it was about 6 weeks, and I wrote down a plan for what I was going to work on each week. So I knew that my dissertation was going to be about 3 chapters, so I divided up that time equally between those 3 chapters so that I could look at the beginning of the week and think, okay, it's time to move on to chapter 2 now, it's time to move on to chapter 3. It wasn't a particularly rigid thing, because I did find that as I read something I'd realise that I needed to read something else in order to understand where the dissertation was going, but I do think it was useful for sort of charting my progress over that time. The other thing that I did with that was that I left, I think it was about half a week at the end, that I didn't assign to any particular chapter, and that was just for extra research. So if I found anything particularly complicated and it took extra time, or if there was something interesting that I wanted to have time to go into, I built that in from the beginning. After I'd finished reading, I spent a couple of days tidying up my plan, making sure that everything was ready to write from, and then I wrote the whole thing front to back in 2 weeks. So my dissertation was 10,000 words, which I think is pretty typical, and yeah, I went from having a plan to having the whole thing written, referenced, formatted and submitted in 2 weeks. Obviously you might like to split up your time differently. I know a lot of people like to do a section of reading and then write and then do the next bit of reading. That would stress me out a lot because I wouldn't know where the argument was going. I don't fully understand how people do that, but if you do, then fair play to you, because I definitely couldn't. I think the important thing is just having a plan, having a goal for each week so that you can monitor whether you're on track, and leaving that bit of spillover time in case you find especially difficult or interesting bits. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is how I came up with my topic and my question. So I think there are broadly 2 ways to go about this. The first way, which isn't what I did but I know is what quite a lot of other people do, is to think of which areas you've particularly enjoyed studying, and then sort of narrow it down. So the thought process might be, I enjoy criminal law, I enjoyed learning about self-defence, should the law of self-defence be reformed? And you can sort of narrow and narrow and narrow. I think that can be a good way of finding something that you're interested in. The reason that I didn't do that was, I think if you're looking at something in the way that you've already been taught it, so criminal law, self-defence, you're sort of framed by what other people have said about it already, and it can be very difficult to find novel concepts within that. So you're sort of limited to the reading that you've already done and the ideas that people have already had about it. So I struggled with this for quite a long time, and then what I ended up doing is this second approach, where I started with the problem and then I thought, how can I use an area of law that I'm interested in to tackle this problem? So I'm quite an avid video gamer, and I knew that there'd been a massive sexual abuse scandal a few months previously in the esports industry. And I thought to myself, I'd quite like to tackle that by using an area of law that I'm interested in. So I'm not particularly interested in criminal law, so I didn't really want to look at the criminal remedies for all of that sexual abuse in the esports industry. I'm also not that interested in public law, so I knew I didn't want to look at sort of regulating the games companies. But what I am interested in is private law. So I ended up looking at what victims could do personally to recover compensation for what happened to them. So my project in the end looked at an area of law called vicarious liability, which is about when employers have to pay for bad things that their employees do, and I applied it to esports, which sort of hadn't been done before. And I think that's quite an interesting way to come up with a question. I think one of the main strengths of my project was how narrow and specific my question was. And a good way to do that is to think about the communities that you're engaged with. So for me it was esports, but maybe, I don't know, you're involved with a club or a society or a sport, or you're particularly interested in specific things that are going on in the world. Think about problems that are happening within that sphere and then apply the area of law that you're interested in. And that way, what I really liked was I was interested in the law, I was interested in the problem, and I really enjoyed working on my dissertation throughout the year. I think another really important thing with this is to work out when you're most creative and to capitalise on that. I think if you plan in for the day, think up my dissertation question or whatever, it's quite unlikely that an idea is going to come to you. But if you think about which points in the day you're most creative, so for me it's right before I go to bed and right when I wake up, then you can sort of make yourself think about your dissertation at that point, and it's more likely that something's going to come to you. So I thought of my dissertation when I'd just woken up and I was about to go get a shower, because I thought, why don't I think about what I want to write about for 5 minutes? Okay, and before we get into the next section, I need to explain something really quickly so that you don't get lost. So the first thing that I do, after I've thought of what I'm going to write about, whenever I start a new project, is I create 3 documents. So I create a reading list where I write down everything that I want to read, a reading log where I take notes on all of those things, and then a plan where I put those notes once I've worked out how they fit into my argument. I'll go through how I use all of those in the next sections, but it's just important to know that I set them all up at the beginning and use them all at the same time. Okay, so now I'll talk about how I find my reading, and so we'll start with the reading list document. So in this document, whenever I think to myself, I need to look into this, I need to prove this point, whatever it is, I'll write it down, and then I'll go through and I'll find sources on that point and put them in the reading list. I find it can be quite helpful to separate that reading list into headings, so as you start to work out my dissertation has 3 chapters, or this many arguments, whatever it is, separate that reading list document into those headings and those chapters so that you can keep on top of how much reading you have left for this section and that section. It's easier to manage that way. So whenever I add something to my reading list, I just do this in a really rough sort of note format. I don't want to be wasting time. I'll just put a hyperlink to where the document is, and I'll put a really brief description of what it is, so that when I look at my reading list in the future, when I'm working out what to read that day, I can work out how useful it's going to be for what I want to look into. And in terms of actually finding things to put into that list, the key idea, I think, is to capitalise on everything that you've already got. So it's really important, once you've read something that's useful, to go through the whole bibliography and work out whether any of the things that that person read to make that article are also useful to you. Go through all of the footnotes. If you find a useful argument, go to that footnote, put that source in your reading list. Make sure that every piece of reading that's in that thing that you've just read, if it's useful to you, you've taken it out and you're going to read it yourself. So because of this, I don't sort of find all of my reading in one go at the beginning. I'll find it gradually. So I'll start off with maybe 5 or 6 key sources, and I'll start reading those, I'll start mining them for other sources, and then my reading list will grow and grow and grow as I do my research. In terms of actually finding those key sources, it's not any more difficult than using whatever database your library has. So for me it was Your Search or Google Scholar, and putting in keywords and seeing what comes up. This is where I think it's useful to have your reading list broken down by section or by argument, because if I can look at my reading list and see, oh, I need to do the bit on sort of what the esports industry is like, then when I'm going to those databases I can put in really specific keywords. So rather than just esports, vicarious liability, I can put in esports industry, business models, financial, all of those things. That's a really bad example, but you get what I mean. If it's broken down, you can use more specific keywords and get more reading out of those databases. Obviously you're looking for reputable sources, so you're looking for peer-reviewed journals, you're looking for things that have been cited by other people a lot of the time, and if you start with those quality sources, then you can go into the more specific sources from the sort of niche journals or the newer sources later on, because that can be useful too. I actually ended up using Google a little bit as well. A lot of my dissertation I had to use news sources because this scandal had only just happened. Google was the best search engine for finding those. It was also pretty good for finding sort of parliamentary reports and things like that. That's probably not excellent advice, but you know, try Google, try the other databases, try all of the keywords that you can think of. And that's about it. Start by putting the keywords in, mine those sources for citations, and your reading list should just grow and grow and grow as you think of new things that you need to look into and find new sources. So in this next section I'm going to talk about how I actually take notes on the reading that I've found. So I do this in something that I call my reading log, and this document I tend to break it down so that all of the sources are as easy to find as possible. So I'll tend to do it sort of by type of source, so I'll put all of my cases in one section, I'll put all of my articles in another, all of my news sources in another, and then I'll do it chronologically so that I can see exactly what happened in which order. And that's useful firstly when I'm taking the notes, so that if I see an argument I can see really quickly whether it's been said before, whether this is the first time that it's said. It's also useful when I'm referencing, because it means that I can find all of my detailed notes really quickly. So whenever I start with a new source, I write down my notes in a uniform way. So I have a template for cases and a template for articles, and there are spaces for writing the author's name, the date, the journal, things like that. And there are two key reasons that I think it's useful to take notes in this uniform way. Firstly, it means that I spot the same information about every single article. So writing down the author's name means that I'll see whether I've read previous things by the same author before. Writing down the journal helps me to think, is that a reputable journal? Is it peer reviewed? And then the second thing is, taking down all of this information means that I should have it right there when I do my referencing. Okay, and once I've filled in that basic information, I'll fill in the rest of the notes when I'm reading. So when I'm reading an article, I'll be thinking to myself, is the author making a point that I need to use in my dissertation? Can I usefully cite them? Is this an interesting argument that I want to think about some more? And if it is, then I'll write it down in my own notes. It's important to think critically here. You're not just trying to write down a narrative of what happened in the article, you're just trying to get information that it'll be useful for you to have in the future. And when I'm making these notes, I always do them in the same way. So I'll start with the page number so that I can reference the specific point if it actually makes it into my dissertation. I'll then summarise what the argument is that the author is making. Sometimes I'll also put my own little comments in, so if I want to compare it to something that I've previously read, or if I've had a new idea about how the argument can go, I tend to put that in underneath, and I'll tend to highlight it in a different colour so that I know that it's my own original thought. And then usually I'll also put a direct quote in, especially if the wording is particularly good or I want to be able to remember exactly how it was said. I find that this is useful because if I keep hold of those original quotes, I can critique exact wording, or I can go back and see exactly how the point was made if I end up writing something about that point. If I'm reading a case, then it'll be pretty similar, apart from that I won't necessarily just go page by page and write down all of my notes. I'll tend to structure it more by what was important in the case. So I'll always put the key decision that was come to right at the beginning, and I'll highlight it, and then I'll put other arguments and specific paragraph numbers in underneath with the quotes and with my own original thoughts highlighted. And then immediately after I have read a source, I'll move on and put anything useful from that note into my plan. So let's go into the next section. Okay, so planning. My planning document is obviously broken down in the same way that my dissertation will be. So I'll start with chapter 1, then chapter 2, then chapter 3, and I'll go through argument by argument. And my key idea with my plan is that I want to write out a really long form of my dissertation. I want everything that's going to end up in the dissertation in my plan. I like taking really detailed plans. It helps me to know every single author that I'm going to cite in every single paragraph and have that all in order before I start writing. So after I've taken my notes on a new source, I'll filter that into my plan. So I'll take those specific bullet points and I'll move them into the relevant section of my plan. So the way that I do this is I'll go through the notes I've just made on that article, and every time I see something that I want to put into my plan, I'll just copy and paste the whole of that bullet point into the relevant section of my plan. And as I start planning more, I'll get more of an idea of which things belong in which section, if that makes sense. So I might know I have a paragraph in chapter 3 where I'm arguing that this case was decided incorrectly. Well, if what I've just read discusses that that case was decided incorrectly, I might copy and paste that argument into that section of the plan. This plan document starts off really messy. Obviously it's much easier to filter your notes into the plan once it's all detailed and you know what each argument is going to be. But earlier on it's very difficult to work out, you know, what goes in which chapter, even certainly which paragraph is which paragraph, and what's the argument that I'm making. So certainly for the first sort of 4 or 5 sources that I read, I can end up putting things in the wrong place and rejigging them, and I can end up spending quite a lot of time with the plan just going through reorganising where all of the points are. And I'll write headings and notes and things, again highlighted so that I know that they're my own original idea, about what the point is that I'm actually making about all of these different sources that I've got in. Very early on I can tend to sort of scribble things down on paper as well, do diagrams to try to work out where the argument is going. I spend a lot of time just rejigging paragraphs, putting them in different places, rejigging whole sections, talking to people, boring them about where the argument is going, and then later on things will solidify and it becomes easier to move the reading into the plan. I find with this it can be quite useful to make multiple drafts of the plan. I can get quite attached to how the plan is looking and then not want to make any radical changes. So I'll just make another draft, try out the radical change. If it works, fantastic, I'll work from that one. If not, I can scrap that and I still have how the argument was going to progress before. And that's about it really. As I start reading more, I'll find that multiple authors have made the same or different points, and they'll end up in my plan in the same section. I'll end up with little notes saying, I think this person's right and this person's wrong, or everybody agrees on this, whatever it is. And I'll end up with an entire plan for how the argument is going to progress, and I can see each different source that I'm going to use to make all of the different points, all of my thoughts, and I can see the original quotes in there. Okay, and then the final thing we need to talk about is writing. So I don't start writing until my plan is completely finished. The last thing that I'll do before I start writing is I'll go through section by section. I'll make sure that every paragraph sort of progresses in a logical order. So all the different sources that I've got in, I'll think to myself, am I going to open the paragraph talking about this one or talking about that one? Have I got all of the ones that I'm going to compare and contrast next to each other? And have I got every single paragraph planned how I'm going to write it? As you're going through that last time before you start writing, you can also start to get some kind of an idea of how long the dissertation is going to be. So I tend to find that my paragraphs are about 180 words long. Might be different for you, but it's a good idea to figure it out. It can be useful. And then obviously you can count up how many paragraphs you've got, times that by 180, and you can work out what word count you're working at. If you're over word count, then the final time you go through the plan can be a really good time to cut out the weakest paragraphs, so that you don't end up writing stuff that you don't end up using. What I ended up doing right before I started writing is I made a little, it was like an A4 sheet, and I wrote down every single paragraph that I was going to write. So introduction to vicarious liability, discussion of this case, discussion of that case, whatever it was, with a little tick box next to it. And then as I wrote that paragraph, I could tick it off and see visually how far through my dissertation I was. It's definitely not necessary, but I found it quite motivating. It can also be helpful when you do that to set a goal for how many paragraphs you're going to write each day. So I ended up writing about 8 paragraphs in a day. Again, it'll vary, figure out how you work best. I found I needed a couple of paragraphs to get into it, and those first couple of paragraphs would be really slow as I sort of woke my brain up for the day. I could then focus for maybe 4 or 5 more paragraphs, and then I'd start to get tired at the end, and 8 paragraphs ended up working pretty well for me per day. As I'm actually writing, I have a split screen, and on one side I have the document that I'm writing in, and in the other I have my plan. And obviously I'll just scroll through working paragraph by paragraph. And what I'll do is I'll write a whole paragraph, and I'll then go through and put footnotes in according to my plan whenever I've used a new source. Now I don't do all of my formatting at this stage. All that I'll put in the footnote is Smith 2010 page 15, whatever I need to be able to do that footnote later, so as long as it makes sense to me, it's fine. The reason that I do that is obviously I need to know where the sources are, or it would be a complete nightmare to find them later in the finished written text. But if I stopped and did all of my formatting neatly, I think it would break the rhythm that I'm in. So I just do it roughly first time. And it's really important here to record all of the information that you need. So you've got the page numbers in your plan. Make sure that you put the page numbers in the footnotes so that you don't have to go looking for that later. I also find that as I go through, I'll find that specific points are unsupported, or I'm not entirely sure where I got something from. That's fine, I'll just put a footnote in and I'll say, figure this out, or find this thing. I actually find writing, once I'm in the swing of it, to be one of the easier things to do, because I can set a definite goal for myself each day, and then I find it useful to walk away and actually take it quite easy to make sure that I'm writing well and being creative. Okay, and then once I've written it all that I have left to do is to check through it, get it down to the word count, so cut out anything that's particularly weak, and then do all my formatting, so sorting out all of those citations so they're in the proper style, putting in my bibliography and all of the introductory pages, things like that. The formatting ended up taking me, I think it was 2 full days, so definitely leave enough time to do that. The cleaning up the citations especially took me, I think it was about 12 hours, so please don't underestimate that. So that's it. I'm not sure how clear this will have been. It's really hard to describe something that's sort of just naturally how I got into it. So if I've explained something really clumsily and you've missed it, then please do just ask me in the comments and I'll try to get back to you. So I hope this has been useful, and I hope you managed to figure out a question, a topic that really interests you. I really enjoyed my dissertation. It ended up being one of my favourite things that I did last year, and I think that's because I made it so uniquely my own. Best of luck writing your own dissertations, and I will see you again really soon. Bye.